Hello, I'm Gareth Vaughan. I'm the Erasmus Plus coordinator at the English department of Rostock University and also generally responsible for coordinating most things related to exchanges or students having been abroad. I've prepared this short video presentation to try to help bring to life a lot of the material you'll find on our web pages and try to explain a lot of the areas that can be a little bit confusing for students and just give you a better feeling about knowing what your options are, understanding the process and the forms and the people involved a little bit. And it must be said, although we're living in strange times at the moment with COVID and the ideas of mobility, it's important still to plan ahead and be aware of what your options are. And so that's what this is really intended for. Now, every single student of English should intend to spend time in a country with English as a native speaking language, regardless of whether you're a Lehramt student or a Bachelor one, because it's just such an invaluable cultural experience. Now, typical options that people tend to take are either studies at educational institutions, that might be via formal programs such as Erasmus Plus or the Promise programs with our partners in America. You may take part in language courses or be a language assistant or teach somewhere. You may do or have done some au pair work or work and travel in places like Australia or other forms of work experience in general. All of these things will help for your development and certainly help you understand Anglo-American culture. So I'm just going to mention a few things about our Erasmus Plus program. Obviously, a lot is up in the air at the moment, and aside from winter coming, Brexit is looming quite hard for December and January. But generally speaking, in the past, we've enjoyed great partnerships with other partner institutions such as Cardiff in Wales, Cork in Ireland, Dublin, Malta, Aberdeen in Scotland, Lithuania, we have Klaipeda, and these are really, really great English departments at which you can live and study, often take part in courses that can be accredited when you come back, and enjoy a generally good support network of financing via the European Union. And of course, regardless of what happens with Brexit, certain partners such as Cork, Dublin and Malta will continue to enjoy exchanges with us. I should mention that there are other partners that you'll find listed at the university, such as Newcastle, but those are often agreements that take place with other departments, such as sometimes Germanistic, Romanistic, and it's important if you'd like to go there that you apply via them. Regarding the application procedure, of course, what with Brexit looming, I'd recommend that you keep an eye on our Institute webpage, because this year we want to wait until after the Brexit decision to see exactly where we are with what we're doing from our partners. So I'll be updating information there about what to do, when to do it, and what to be informed about. If you're interested in going slightly further afield, we do have other partner universities in North America, such as the USA, Canada, and most of those are organised via the Promise programme, and I should say the application procedure and everything there is generally adopted and taken on by the International House, to which I'll come back a little bit later. We also have other partners in Argentina, Brazil and all over the place. And of course, we'd encourage generally you experiencing life in a foreign country anywhere it goes, and we'll give you all the support we certainly can. But for detailed information about those partners, I'd recommend visiting the International House team and particularly Maya van Wedelstedt. Of course, there are numerous other opportunities available to you, and many of our students have enjoyed using Travel Go programs, the DAAD programs, for example, and I'd certainly recommend looking to those links and investigating all of your possibilities before you make a decision about what to do. But one key portal that can help you make decisions might be looking to the Erfahrungsberichte from other students to see what they've done and how they've enjoyed it. I'd certainly recommend coordinating that closely with the International House team. Many students have enjoyed taking part in different forms of work experience, and it's something that we'd absolutely encourage. I should make it clear that we don't have any specific partnerships ourselves from the department, but you will find a lot of information about this via websites or the International House again. And my main tip to you here is many of our students in the past have organised these things themselves, where they've often written to schools, for example in Britain, and just asked if they could work there for a few months and then organised accommodation and things. Now, we will support you in any way possible for these activities. If you require letters of recommendation, help understanding administrative forms or filling certain of them in, that's what people like Mr. Bowen, I, Lucy Catherine, all of us at the department would certainly encourage and give you our full support for. Okay, one question that many students have is, am I going to lose time from my studies if I go abroad? And although we would always emphasize that you're investing really in your own development and your general future by going abroad, it is often possible for us to recognize and accredit things that you've done at other educational institutions. Now, if you were, for example, to take part in Erasmus Plus and go to a partner institution, of course, if you find module components or courses there that reflect the things you would have done in your program here, then Mr. Bowen and I can generally find a way to make sure that that can be recognized and accredited here. The key thing is communication. And that's why we have numerous forms and a system in place to make sure that everything's transparent and that we all have a clear understanding. Just to help you understand the procedure there, whether you're using Erasmus Plus or not, it's worth communicating with Mr. Bowen and I before you leave and filling out essentially some form of what we'd call a learning agreement. Now, what that means is that before you travel, you would give us an indication of the kind of course or module component that you would take part in, provide us with a description of it, talk about the kind of demands, whether you would have to complete an exam or assignment, how many hours and so on. And then what we can do from that is essentially assure you or promise you that when you return, that could serve as an equivalent for something that you'd have done when you come back. Now, the one question that often arises from that is if you go to another institute in the future, often it's the case that just at our university, the information isn't always up to date, that they don't have the listings for upcoming semesters, but only previous ones. What we would advise there is that you make a plan in accordance with previous semesters or the existing information that they have and work with that as best as possible, because all of that can be updated once you actually arrive there. And that's why there's a secondary form known as the During the Mobility Learning Agreement, in which essentially when you arrive at any educational institution and, for example, some courses may not be offered, or you may find that there are other courses that you find more interesting or valuable to you, we have this form to essentially communicate to us that you're deleting certain courses, adding some courses, or making changes for certain reason. And again, so it gives us a chance to say, okay, that's what you're doing, and this is how we can assure it would be recognized for when you return home and, and accredited, essentially. Now, the forms look something like this. On the left side, you'll see the agreement for before the mobility. On the right side for during the mobility. Of course, I'd explain more about that in detail if you get that far and hopefully come to visit me or communicate about those forms. But what's absolutely crucial too is that regardless of whether you've used Erasmus Plus or not, that you make sure that you have some form of transcript from the institute that you've visited that outlines all of the courses you've taken, the kind of marks or grades you're awarded, in addition to any sort of Leistungspunkte or ECTS points, so that essentially we can try to bring that together on our own institute's transcript of records, as you'll see there, so that we can communicate that clearly with the Lehrprüfungsamt or the BA-Amt to make sure that whatever you've done can be recognized as best and in full as possible. One thing that I'd also like to explain here, and that has been confusing to some students in the past, is also this departmental internal accreditation agreement. Now, I developed this with Mr. Bowen because the standard forms that our international house offers don't go into a lot of detail regarding module components or courses you may take part in as respects to course descriptions, details about how many hours the programs take place for, precisely what form of assessment they have. And so it's very important that you communicate those kinds of details with Mr. Bowen and I using this form, because, of course, if you go somewhere, let's say like France, and we choose just the French title for a course, and we translate it to being something, it's still often unclear for us precisely what you've done and how we could accredit it for when you come back. So this is just a way to make sure that there's absolute transparency, and it makes it as easy and efficient as possible between both you and us to know what you've been doing and how it can be recognized at our home institution. Okay, one thing that will be particularly interesting to those Lehramt students among you is what's known as the Ausbildungsrelevante Auslandsaufenthalt for the LPA. And that's really one of the most horrible things they could have designed for a British person like me to have to say. Now, what that ultimately means is that the Lehrprüfungsamt require that you spend at least 12 weeks in a country with English recognized as a prime native speaker language. And that has caused some confusion in the past. So just to be clear, the listing that we have been given, because we don't decide that at the department, it comes from the LPA, are Australia, the United Kingdom, for as long as it remains united, Ireland, Canada, Malta, New Zealand, South Africa, and the United States of America. Some students have pointed out, I think in a valid sense, that there are other countries like Uganda and in India where English is a very dominant language and also a legally official language. But the important thing for you to know is those are the countries that the LPA officially lists and recognize. If you have any queries about exceptions and you feel you have a strong case, I would advise going to the LPA or communicating particularly with Frau Delf at the LPA to make your case there. We're not the ones that can unfortunately make those kinds of decisions. Now, one other thing I'd like to make clear is that Mr. Bowen is principally responsible for coordinating the verification of that time spent abroad with the LPA, though I can help coordinate that with him as well. What helps us do that is essentially, if you go abroad or you're planning to go abroad, make sure that you collect and keep a record of anything that can prove or substantiate the time that you've spent doing something relevant to your English studies. What that essentially means is that if you can keep flight tickets, proof of accommodation and when and for the duration of where you stayed somewhere, but particularly things like employment contracts, if you happen to take part in work experience schemes or travel and go or something like that, or anything related to courses or educational institutes where you take part in things, that's crucial because, of course, where they mention Ausbildungsrelevante Auslandsaufenthalt, what they mean is that you should spend at least 12 weeks doing something relevant to your studies, not just 12 weeks in a country with English recognized as a native speaking language. So that's why holidays and such things as pure travel do not, unfortunately, count in that kind of case there. Okay. The last thing I want to say about this that people often ask questions about, to clarify, is although many students opt to complete this in an entire block, where if you traveled via Erasmus Plus, for example, you'd often spend roughly half a year or an entire year in a place such as Cork, and then that becomes quite easy, or via Promos, you might spend nearly a year in America. You can choose to stagger those weeks. And what that means is for those students that would like to complete their studies in as short a time period as possible, it is possible in the semester breaks, for example, to spend, let's say, 2 weeks or 3 weeks doing something or engaging activities relevant to your studies, and then to accumulate or to add those weeks together over the course of your studies, as long as in total they come to those 12 weeks. That's just one point that can be confusing to some people that I want to make quite clear there. The last thing that's important to say about your Ausbildungsrelevante Auslandsaufenthalt is that you may have already been in a country with English as a native speaking language that you could have recognized with the LPA. Now, what the LPA have informed us about that is provided that you have been to one of those recognized countries within at least 3 years prior to the start of your English studies here at the university in a way that can be recognized, that can still be registered. It's very, very important that you come to Mr. Bowen and myself as soon as possible with any kinds of documentation, employment contracts, and so on that can substantiate or prove you've done that, so that we can communicate that with the LPA, and then that would be one more thing off of your to-do list in that respect. So, which people do you have to be familiar with? Of course, the ugly mug in the top side there is myself, but the one thing I want to draw your attention to there is that I've started using a mobility-specific email address to try to keep a focus on that and this kind of program, in contrast to all the standard university course questions and administration and so on. So if you have any inquiries or you want to communicate about exchanges you're going to be or have been involved in, please communicate with me at mobility.iaa@uni-rostock.de. The other advantage of that email address is that Mr. Bowen also has access to it in case I'm ever ill or away and you need a response relatively soon. So that's the thing to be sure of there. Mr. Bowen himself is also important to be familiar with, because although many people coordinate these things via me, it is Mr. Bowen who is principally responsible for Anerkennung, or the recognition of marks or grades from other educational institutions. And he also is the direct correspondent with the LPA. Other faces with whom you should be familiar, however, are also those from the International House. The top face there is that of Daniel Reinekers, and he's responsible for Erasmus Plus in the outgoing sense. He is the one who ultimately requires your signed and stamped documentation if you take part in that program, and can give you detailed, specific advice about anything related to budgets or the bureaucratic administrative side of that process. And it's really worth becoming familiar with him and seeing him if you are selected for one of those programs. If you decide to investigate a non-Erasmus style program, then you should definitely visit Maya van Wedelstedt, who's the smiling face in the lower side of that slide. She is entirely familiar with the Promise program and forms of grants and funding that will help you experience life abroad, and is generally knowledgeable about many other programs with which you should be familiar. So please try to go to see them, and particularly visit one of their Erstberatung sessions to get a general feel for what programs are available and what's required of you in terms of going for some form of exchange. So, ultimately, we would wholly encourage you to experience life abroad at some point in time. I know that's not particularly easy at the moment, but we have to assume that at some point life will sort of go on, or you'll be able to sort of make plans for these things. So try not to get too stuck and dragged down by this moment. Try to think ahead. Try to become familiar with the options available for you. And as written there, I'll look forward to assisting you in exploring the worlds and discovering more about yourselves. Thank you very, very much.